Hello and welcome back to the online training courses on risk management for tour operators. In this course, we will talk about risk assessment. We'll first introduce what a risk assessment is. We will then explain the 5 steps of a standard risk assessment. Then we'll talk about the next homework assignment and present the references this course is based on. You will remember that we introduced the different parts of a standard risk management system in Course 1. The risk assessment is the first part of the standard risk management system. In the risk assessment, we want to analyze and see what can go wrong in our tours. So, what is a risk assessment? A risk assessment involves finding and assessing the risks in your tours. Why should you do this? Being aware of the risk can help limit the number of accidents. If you are aware of the risk, you can come up with ways to decrease it. Let's go over the 5 steps of risk assessment. Step 1. What are the risks? The first step is finding which activities in your tour could lead to accidents. So here we want to identify the risks. In this step, it is necessary to look at the entire tour and find all the different risks. Let's start with an example of a very simple tour. It starts with collecting your clients at the airport. You then drive to a beautiful site and they have a 2-hour walking tour. Finally, you drive your clients to their hotel and they spend the night there. Now let's look at the tour more closely. Specifically, let's look at the first step where we collect the clients and drive. This part of the tour involves collecting clients at the airport and then driving for 3 hours. So, what are the different risks in this step? Some examples are client forgotten. A client could be left behind at the airport because the guide forgets him. Bruises. Because the road is bumpy and it's a long drive, a client could get bruises in the car if, for example, he does not have a seatbelt. Car accident. A car accident could occur because of weather conditions, unsafe vehicles, unsafe roads, etc. Get lost. The driver could get lost and not find the destination because he does not know the route very well. Dehydration. A client could forget to drink enough water and could then suffer from dehydration. So on and so forth. What about the second part of the trip? It involves exiting the car, 2 hours of walking, lunch by the river, and returning to the car. What are the different risks in this step? Some examples are sunburn. A client could suffer from sunburn. Fall on ground. A client could trip because the ground is rocky or uneven. Get lost. A client could get lost and get separated from the group. Or a more dramatic example, drowning. A client could drown in the river, etc. Step 2. Are these risks acceptable? Next, we need a system to answer, are the risks that we identified before acceptable? This system should be based on 2 questions. First, how likely is the risk? If the risk becomes reality often, we say that it is a high likelihood risk and we give it the maximum value of 3. So for example, sunburns. In some countries, clients often get sunburns. If the risk becomes reality sometimes, we say that it is a medium likelihood risk and we give it the value of 2. So in some countries, for example, clients sometimes trip over uneven ground. If the risk becomes reality only rarely, so if it is very unlikely, we say that it is a low likelihood risk, and we give it the value of 1. So for example, clients dying. The second question is, how serious is the risk? If when the risk becomes reality, there are life-threatening injuries or high levels of unhappiness for the client, we say the risk is high seriousness, and we give it a value of 3. An obvious example would be if a client dies. If when the risk becomes reality, a doctor is required, or there are medium levels of unhappiness for the client, we say the risk is medium seriousness and we give it a value of 2. For example, the client gets a cold. If when the risk becomes a reality, there are small injuries or there is only a little bit of unhappiness, we say the risk is low seriousness and we give it a value of 1. So this could be, for example, a client tripping over uneven ground. So again, are these risks acceptable? To find out, we simply add seriousness and likelihood. Let's demonstrate this in an example. Let's take the risk of a client tripping over uneven ground. Let's say this is low seriousness. The client is only going to be a little unhappy, so we give seriousness a value of 1. And let's say that it's medium likelihood, since tripping happens sometimes in adventure tourism, so we give likelihood a value of 2. Seriousness plus likelihood, 1 plus 2, is 3. So, is the risk acceptable or not? What does the 3 mean? Well, if seriousness plus likelihood is equal to 1 to 2, the risk is acceptable. If seriousness plus likelihood is equal to 3 to 5, the risk is maybe acceptable. If seriousness plus likelihood is equal to 6, the risk is unacceptable. So, what does this mean for our example? A client tripping over uneven ground is a maybe acceptable risk. So now that we have a system in place to see whether our risks are acceptable or not, let's turn to step 3. Step 3. How can I analyze the risks? To analyze the risks, you have to use the system from the previous step. So answer the following questions for each identified risk. How likely is the risk? How serious is the risk? And is the risk acceptable? Let's continue with our previous example. We had identified some risks. Let's now assess seriousness, likelihood, and whether the risk is acceptable. Now it's important to keep in mind that here we assess the risk before risk management, so before there are any formal rules in place to decrease these risks. As a reminder, I'll put the risk assessment key here. Let's go over the first example. A client could be forgotten at the airport. Let's say that the risk is medium seriousness, because the client is likely to be quite unhappy about this. So we give it a value of 2 for seriousness. And let's say that the risk is medium likelihood. This kind of thing can happen sometimes if there are no formal procedures in place to prevent it. So we give it a likelihood of 2. Is the risk acceptable? 2 plus 2 is 4, which makes it maybe acceptable. Let's go to the second example. A client could get bruises in the car. Let's say that this risk is low seriousness, because bruises don't usually require a doctor, and the client is only going to be a little bit unhappy about them. So we give it a seriousness of 1. Now to the likelihood. Bruising does happen sometimes, especially if we don't have rules in place to prevent it. So the risk is medium likelihood. So we give it a likelihood of 2. 1 plus 2 is 3. So again, the risk is maybe acceptable. Third, a car accident could occur. This risk is high seriousness because the potential consequences can be life-threatening for staff and clients. So we give it a value of 3. And let's say a car accident is medium likelihood since it does happen sometimes in many countries. So we give it a value of 2. So 3 plus 2 is 5. So this risk is also maybe acceptable. But as you can see, it is less acceptable than the first 2 risks, since 5 is the highest number. Now it's important to note that these values might all be different in your own countries and tours. This is just an example of a risk assessment of a fictional tour operator in some country. Let's turn to step 4. How do I manage the risks? We will talk more about ways to manage the risks in course 3. In the next few slides, we will just talk about how managing the risk is connected to your risk assessment. So, part of the risk assessment is deciding what do we do with the maybe acceptable and unacceptable risks. We could decide to manage the risk. Managing the risk means looking at ways to decrease the seriousness or likelihood of the risk. As I said, we will discuss this more in detail in course 3. We could also decide to avoid the risk. This means we eliminate the risk by changing or stopping that part of the tour. So for example, if we want to avoid the risk of a car accident, we have to stop driving cars. Or we could accept the risk. This means we don't do anything to combat the risk, but we accept it and make sure our insurance covers it in case of an accident. Most of the time we will choose to manage the risk, because avoiding the risk is often difficult to do in adventure tourism, and we usually also don't want to simply accept the risk if there are ways of managing it. After we decide to manage a risk, we then need to decide the following. How do we manage the risk? So what rules or procedures do we want to have in place to decrease the seriousness and/or likelihood of the risk? We also need to decide who is responsible for managing the risk on the ground, the guide, the driver, the hotel? We then need to decide where is this rule formalized. For a standard risk management system, it is important to document your rules. You have to formally write them down somewhere. Let's return to our previous example to show what this will look like. Let's start with the first example, forgetting a client at an airport. Do we want to manage, accept, or avoid the risk? Well, we can't avoid the risk because that would mean that we would have to avoid picking clients up from the airport. This is not something we can do. We also don't want to simply accept the risk because it has a value of 3. It's only a maybe acceptable risk and not an outright acceptable risk. So we decide to manage it. So, how should we manage the risk? We can, for example, give the guide a list of the clients and make him or her do a roll call before departure. So who is responsible for managing the risk on the ground? The guide. Documentation. So where will this rule be written down? Let's say we formalize this rule in our standard operating procedures for guides. We will go over standard operating procedures in more detail in course 3. Let's turn to the next example. A client could get bruises in the car. Do we want to manage, accept, or avoid the risk? Since it's also only a maybe acceptable risk, we decide to also manage it. How do we manage this? For example, the driver and guide could remind everyone to put on their seatbelts before departure. If clients have their seatbelts on, they won't bump against things in the car as much. So who is responsible on the ground in this case? The driver and the guide. Documentation. These rules can be formalized in our standard operating procedures for drivers and our standard operating procedures for guides. Let's turn to the final example. A car accident could occur. This is the most serious risk from the examples. We don't simply want to accept it because there are many rules that we can put in place to reduce the likelihood and seriousness of the risk. Plus, our insurance won't tolerate cars crashing over and over again. We also can't avoid the risk because avoiding the risk of a car accident means we could not drive cars anymore. So we try to manage it. How do we manage it? For example, the driver can check the safety of his vehicle before departure. This is just one thing he can do. He will also have to follow the local traffic laws, take breaks, etc. So who's the responsible person on the ground? The driver. Documentation. These rules can be written down in our standard operating procedures for drivers. Again, just as a reminder, these are just examples, and the way of managing a risk as well as deciding who's responsible may be very different in your country and company. So, what happens now that we have managed these risks? Well, we have to reassess the risks to see if there are improvements. In your risk assessment, you will always have to do an assessment before risk management and after risk management. So let's go to the first example. A client could be forgotten at the airport. We managed the risk in the previous step by giving the guide a list of the clients and having him or her do a roll call before departure. Most companies are probably already doing this. So, how does this affect seriousness and/or likelihood? Well, it doesn't reduce the seriousness. The client would still be quite unhappy about being left behind, so the value stays 2. The risk management does, however, reduce the likelihood of the risk, because the guide will make sure that all the clients on her list are there, so the new likelihood is 1. 2 plus 1 is 3. It's still a maybe acceptable yellow risk, but we managed to reduce the risk from 4 to 3. Let's turn to the client getting bruises in the car. We managed this risk by making the driver and guide remind everyone to put on their seatbelts. This won't reduce the seriousness of the bruising, so it stays 1 in seriousness. The risk management procedure will, however, reduce the likelihood of the risk. If the client has a seatbelt on, he is less likely to, for example, bump his head against the car ceiling, so the likelihood reduces to 1. 1 plus 1 is 2, another improvement. Finally, let's turn to the car accident. So we managed the risk by having the driver check the safety of his vehicle before departure, follow local traffic laws, take breaks, etc. If a car accident does occur, it's going to be less serious since the car overall meets safety requirements. For example, fixed seats with seat belts for all clients, airbags, etc. So we give it a new value of 2. The overall likelihood of a car accident is also going to be reduced, because now it will be less likely that our driver causes the accident because he follows traffic laws, speed limit, etc. So let's say the new value is 1. A car accident will only rarely happen now. 2 plus 1 is 3, so we also improved here. Now the final step. Step 5, updating your risk assessment and communication. You should try to make sure you update your risk assessment after every high season. This is important because you might have new tours with new risks, or discover new risks in old tours. You should also make sure that there's one person responsible for risk management in your company, so that one person has an overview of all your risks and risk management activities. You should also make sure that this person communicates to all your staff on risk management matters. There's no point in having a risk management system in place if only management knows about it. Now let's quickly go over the homework assignment. The second homework assignment is to complete a formal risk assessment for all of your company's tours and services. If you want to, you can download the risk assessment template on our website to help you. In this template, you can complete columns A to E. You can complete columns F to L after you do course 3. Please send your assignments to riskmanagementfortourism@gmail.com. Please also feel free to send questions and comments. This course is based on materials from the following references. Thank you for your attention.